Welcome back to Sunday Morning Cafe, where our conversation revolves around resilience in all its different forms. Here lately, we've been on a series about relationship resilience, and I want to interrupt that to tell you about an experience I had last April. There was a night where I simply could not sleep. Try as I would, I tried all kinds of different things. I couldn't get to sleep that whole night long. Guess what happened the next night? The anticipatory anxiety of, am I going to be able to get to sleep? And anxiety began to build around, can I sleep or not? And that pattern went on for some time. The reason I share that experience, because this is National Mental Health Awareness Month. And so I'd like to spend some time talking about resilience in terms of our emotional and mental health. You heard me mention anxiety. There is a backdrop of anxiety that we're all feeling around this time because these aren't normal times. A certain amount of anxiety is just flat out normal. On the other hand, how many of you have had the experience where you actually had a panic attack in the last 6 months? And if you have had one, then I probably don't need to explain to you what goes into that. But if you haven't had one, it's worth knowing that you can feel pain in your chest, a pounding of your heart. You can have dizziness, a feeling like I might be dying. There can be nausea that goes with it. Certainly a fair amount of anxiety. Now, if your family has any kind of history of heart problems, don't assume it's a panic attack. If you're having pain in your chest, by all means make that call. But if you're having panic attacks, or say the anxiety level you have is leaving you fatigued more than you can comfortably live with, is interrupting your concentration with persistent anxious thoughts, and it's making it hard to work or to concentrate, it might be time to make that call to your physician to talk about that, to see if there's a medication that could be helpful to you. Might be time to make that call to a psychotherapist that can begin looking at what are those non-medical ways to address some of this as well. Another thing that I think you could say is normal around these times is a certain amount of lowered mood. Not just anxiety, but just a certain amount of lowered mood, like some sadness, particularly as the cold weather comes on and there'll be more time indoors, less socially gathering outdoors. Some kind of sadness, it's normal. But what I'd like you to consider doing for yourself or someone you live with, if you think that level of sadness has gotten to a deeper place, you might put into your search engine Beck Depression Inventory Self-Scoring. And you'll pull up a highly reliable, valid test that's very short. You can do it in just a few minutes, and then it gives you a scoring key. And it can help you determine if your levels of lowered mood reach clinical levels where it's a good idea to call your doc. Now, for my money, calling a psychiatrist is the best professional to help with the medical end of it. But it's very hard to get into psychiatrists right now because they're so busy. In fact, it's estimated that right now about a third of us are experiencing depression. I mean, a full third of the people in our country. You ask someone in my profession, and we might tell you that it's higher than 1/3. So this is not a thing to kind of mess with. So what'll happen a lot of times, though, when you get to a medical professional who'll write that script, they may mistakenly tell you, now we've taken care of it. Actually, what you'll experience in psychotherapy or counseling that goes along with that medication is going to get further than the medication alone. Let me just give you a couple of criteria that might help you to see how am I doing around the area of depression. If you're experiencing what in my profession we call anhedonia, which just simply means things that used to make me feel enjoyment or pleasure, I don't get enjoyment or pleasure out of that. That's one criteria. Another one you might look at is I don't really feel like being around other people. Isolation, that would be another one. A third one would be I find myself with a persistent sadness. I even find myself crying for no apparent reason. Now, in men, it may look like just a temper that seems to come out of nowhere way more frequently. That might be an indicator. My concentration, I can't read so well. It's impairing my ability to go to work. that thought that there's not a lot of hope for my present or hope for my future. These are all characteristics of when a real depression is set in. Obviously, the more severe depression would be having thoughts of self-harm or suicidal thoughts. If you have somebody you care about, asking someone if they're having thoughts of self-harm never made anybody ever commit suicide. If you get the answer back that yes, I am having thoughts like that, the next question to ask is, do you have a plan? And if the answer is yes, you move right away into action, whether that's calling a physician, well, you call a physician for sure, but it might even require going to an emergency department to address that. If your loved one or yourself is experiencing these symptoms of depression and you're a gun owner, it's time to call someone who loves you to take your guns for a while until you get this taken care of. Because what the science tells us is that men who have guns in their house are more frequently successful at committing suicide, because when you're impulsive, that weapon is going to make you successful at committing suicide. And you just don't want an impulsive act like that to create a condition that you can't recover from. So I mentioned earlier something about my sleep problem. Many theorists believe that the active ingredient in depression is sleeplessness. The more depressed you get, the more sleep is hard to come by. The more sleep is hard to come by, the more deep the depression gets dug. So I want to spend just a little bit of time here talking about sleep hygiene. So many of us are having that problem these days. The two places I most learned about proper sleep hygiene is being a dad of toddlers and going to a monastery, a Trappist monastery on a retreat. With my toddlers, what do you do with toddlers to help them sleep? What I used to do is you give them a bath. The bath's over, we're reading some stories. We have prayers that we do, and I would try to make up a story that they'd ask. They give me the subject matter, and I try to make up a story and let them drift off to sleep to a story. The other place I've learned about sleep hygiene is at this monastery, going to night prayer, which in a Trappist monastery happens about 8 at night because they're going to wake up at 3 in the morning to pray again. But there at 8 o'clock, what do you experience? You walk into a dark chapel. One candle is lit on a sacred picture of, in this case, it was an icon of Mary. Probably no mistake that it would be a motherly character. There was a lullaby that was sung. The church's lullaby for night prayer, Salve Regina, Mater Misericordiae. So there's a lullaby. Before the monks go to bed, they stop in front of the abbot, who's the head guy. He puts his hands on their head, prays a little night prayer, they go to bed. So to take out of those things, how are you putting yourself to sleep? What are your bedtime rituals? So for instance, sleep hygienists tell us a dark room with no light in it. Having that room be cold is helpful, and that's not hard to do with the weather changing. Making sure there's no clock that you can see, because you know that anticipatory anxiety, oh my gosh, you know it's 10 and I'm not asleep yet. Oh, it's 10:30, look at that, I'm not asleep yet. Have that clock turned away from you so you can't see it. Don't wake up your optic nerve with screens with light in your eyes. If you're going to read your bedtime story, make it a paper book. For myself, I wear this headlamp that you wear camping when you don't want mosquitoes. It's a red light. It looks so goofy to be wearing that, but there's no bright lights, and it doesn't wake my wife up, so I can read my paper book. You don't want a page turner. I'm reading this big, thick biography on Truman that's like encyclopedic, so you can drift off to sleep with that book in your hand. What are your night prayers? You kind of want to ask yourself, what are those rituals? The other thing sleep hygienists want to tell us is make sure your bedtime's the same time every night. You know, we watch animals doing that. It gets dark, they go to sleep. It gets light, they wake up. Putting ourselves into that kind of circadian rhythm is a really good idea. That's when you go to bed. What about sleep hygiene through the course of the day? What am I consuming that helps me sleep at night? So for instance, a sleep hygienist would say, no caffeine all day long, not even in the morning, which would be a stretch for so many of us, but kind of weaning ourselves off caffeine. Nicotine would be the same thing, because you will be impacted by that even tonight, the coffee you drink in the morning. Alcohol. there's been a huge uptick in drinking. That's also correlated with sleep problems. You know, you'd think that alcohol would help you sleep. Actually, it kind of does the opposite over time. So mind your drinking if you're having problems sleeping. Here's another consumable I'd have you pay attention to. When I was in college, I was studying to be a priest. In the seminary, I listened to the advice of Pope Paul VI, who said, in one hand, a Christian ought to have the Bible, but on the other hand, they ought to have a newspaper so that you're informed. But here's something I'm noticing these days. Our news these days, when I dial into it to become informed, it's not informing me with information. What it's informing me with is anxiety and anger. One thing, if you're having a hard time sleeping, you might consider is to go on a news fast. If you're finding the same thing I am, it's not so much informative with information, it's informative with just psychological information of anxiety and anger. You might put that aside maybe till after the election even. I know a physician who says, I don't want to read more about this coronavirus. If there's some change that I need to do in my life, I'm going to learn it through the hospital, through working here, or going on a medical site. I'm not going to be keeping up with every jot and tittle of what's coming out, because again, of the anxiety-provoking nature of that. Many times we've talked about minding how you take in social media. An awful lot of social media, do I even need to say this out loud? An awful lot of social media is not informative. An awful lot of social media creates spikes in emotion that can interrupt sleep. And I want to address this to men, and I suppose many women too. How many of you are do-it-yourselfers, where you're going to try that project yourself before you hire it out because you want to save some money and you want to be a do-it-yourselfer? When it comes to mental and emotional health, don't be like that guy who thought he could do the plumbing, and he got down there and now he's up to his knees in water before he calls the plumber to get it fixed. If you're noticing any of the things I talked about earlier, rather than trying to be a do-it-yourselfer, reach out for the kind of help to substantively address these problems. So many of us are working way too hard at our mental and emotional health, and a little help would give us just that right tool to make some real progress. Well, thanks for tuning in again this week, and I'll see you next week as we continue our dialogue about what builds resilience and what maintains it.